no, Q, but test, help. Yep. Filter, and we would give it filter equals send. No, it doesn't do that. It does that with QUnit. So instead of, let me check. Okay. Waiting for runners. No, it. Oh. Sen. No, still does it. So in some test runners, you can like skip the test and all that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Ampersand. That's it. Maybe that's it. No. That's Mocha. I just thought that if I would be showing you Ember plus QUnit, and it's totally different from what you used to. So, yeah. But we could switch to that. So instead of like describe component, there would be like module for component, and instead of it would say test, and instead of expect, it would say assert. And that's probably the only difference. And it would be not nested, but like all to the left. So the module ends when you call a different module. So instead of like wrapping it up right like here. So what else can we do for our tests? We could probably like if you go back to these ones, right? We could probably like remove extra bits here and switch to what is called page objects. Who has heard of page objects pattern? Yeah, quite a few people. So page objects are separate like companion classes for your test that are encapsulating what is happening exactly inside your test. So you see, like if over here we would have like 5-6 fields, then our test would be very, very long, because we would have like 5 fields for billing address, another 5 fields for shipping address. It takes a long time. So what people do instead is they create a separate like helper class and would use these helper methods for to encapsulate running stuff inside. So we would have like filling, I don't know, filling billing address, and that would be our method. And inside that method, we would have like 4, 5, 6 calls. So if you're using page objects, the downside is that when you look at your test, you don't really know what is happening inside these classes. Right. I should have shown you something else, and I forgot what it is. So anyway, yeah. Suppose we are adding validation, right? So that's a new thing. So we have a component. We enter data into this component, and at some point before, like, when we click a button, we would like to show us the error messages, right? So we would like to block our users from entering like empty billing address or something, right? So our intuition would be like checking it first with like we have this component tests, and we should add validation logic here, like testing for validation. So, for example, we would start with and like check that billing address is set, because it cannot be null, right? So we have our form checkout. We don't set the billing address. So we try to click on confirm shipping, and we should get an error. And we probably need an action to solve this error and all that. And you're probably like thinking about continue evolving this test at this point. And that's something that I see people do all the time. So you've seen how I started this test. I copy-pasted the existing test, started writing a new one, and like by changing the stuff inside the existing test. It's very easy to do that. It's very easy to like ramp up the number of tests to cover different like angles and all that. But at a certain point, you should look at what you are testing and look at the impact that this new test would get on your application. Validation logic usually doesn't like any concerns with the UI itself. So in order to check that, for example, email is valid, or like the state zip code, or like the state name or the city name is valid, you don't have to like actually draw something on the UI. So probably this is also a bad abstraction for this. So instead, I would create a service. Remember, we have services, right? Where is this? Right? We have services, and we know that the more services we have, the better we are, because they are less fragile. Right? So instead, I would start by creating a service and start by writing a test for the service. So in Ember terms, services are called services. Ember G service. Address validator. Oh my God. Ember destroy service. I'm sorry. Yeah, because I missed a letter there. Ember G address validator. Oh yeah. All right. And I would write a separate test for this service. Where is that? Unit services address validator test, right? So we would call address with some data in it, for example, with empty, and let validation result equals validate address, and we would like expect validation result. Validation result like errors, length to equal 1, something like that, right? So we start with this, and we get an error, of course, because our test is not like, yeah, is not done, because validate address is not a function. So I'm not gonna write this test right now, because it would take time and wouldn't bring much sense to the test. The idea is that you start with isolating pieces of logic that can move UI. In case of components here, until we don't have validation, everything that happens is this, like, where is my component? Wait a second. Yeah, component. Right. If everything that happens in the component is like these 3 lines of code, then it's probably doesn't make sense to isolate it, move it to some service or some object, and write in tests for that. But even these 3 lines of code actually forced us, in case of Ember, start rendering this component and like operating on it on a DOM level. Like operating on a browser level is one thing, operating on DOM level is much faster, but it's still a lot slower than operating on an object level. So these object tests, they would take a lot less time, right? So if you predict that certain kinds of behavior would actually require you to write a lot more code, like starting from, I don't know, 10 lines of code, you should probably isolate it into an object that doesn't have a UI component attached to it. Because in this case, you don't have to initiate a lot of UI related stuff, and you can just write your tests on this object level. It's not an Ember specific advice. This advice applies to any UI code you do. So in order to start testing, in order to like get more tests done, in order to get your tests more, in order to get your tests give you more value, you have to think about how you can isolate the part of the UI that is not really concerned with the UI. So like this validation service, what we would do inside it, we would validate the business rules, right? So we would check, for example, the email address format. Probably I know that some companies and people like disallow emails with Google postfixes, with labels attached to them. If we are validating address, this logic could get very hairy. For example, if we are working with several countries and we want to validate address for each of these countries, then probably each country has its own rules to validate addresses, right? So if you see the potential that something is going to be big, it shouldn't be a UI test anymore. It should be a logic test. And the UI should then test for, like, if a field is invalid, we show an error message. And it doesn't really matter what kind of rules are we breaking, right? It matters that if we have a configuration for a field with the rules attached and messages attached to it, then based on which rule we are breaking, we show the corresponding message. And this is the UI part of the test that we are doing. So for tests, it's important to have the idea, right? So if we draw like our application like this, right? A lot of logic is going to be very low level, right? Checking emails, doing validation, maybe like calculating some values based on other values that the user entered and all that. It sits somewhere over here, right down below, right? It's very simple. It's usually like small, simple functions. You probably never get bugs because you write it once, you check it once, and it's all good. And writing tests for this means your tests will be small, they will be light, and you can have hundreds of them. And if you change your, if you're doing something silly, you probably catch bugs here. On the other hand, at the very high level, you would get tests that give you realism of the situation. And realism is very tricky because, for example, people tend to have these very high level environments, say UAT environment, QA environment, something like that. And say you have several boxes, that talk to each other, that talk to the database, and you run these tests on this environment, like they go here, then get there, then give you results, right, and go back to the browser, right? So when you do something like this, you probably want this environment be as realistic as possible, but it's very difficult to get this very realistic. For example, if you are using, say on production, you are using a CDN to host your assets. Does it mean that your QA environment has a CDN for assets? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but the general rule is that there are certain things that are extremely difficult to, it's extremely difficult to, how to say, to simulate on a QA environment. Say third-party accounts, billing, I don't know, maybe like real-time data sometimes can be very tricky to simulate. And maybe your simulation code at certain point will grow into a separate beast that is even harder than your production environment, right? So most of the time it makes sense to have very few high-level tests that just to check that certain things are working correctly, like because they would guarantee that like different components can see each other. When we have an issue with connecting here, right, with the connection here, we will not catch it with any unit test, but we could potentially catch it with integration tests, right? But in general, the lower your tests are, the better. And if you are working on testing, start like this. Start writing one big test, for example, that does everything and takes 40 minutes to run and has several hundred lines of code long and all that, right? And then you would isolate individual components and start testing them based on the data, what they are doing and all that. And at certain point in time, later on, you will be able to break this bigger one into smaller things, because if you have a very involved, scenario, turns out that most of individual steps in this scenario can be simulated and tested on a lower level, and that means that on a higher level, the only concern you still have is that after each step you get to the next step. So you are more interested in the fact that the flow is passing through, rather than the results of each individual steps during that flow. So high-level tests, like I wrote here, these ones. These ones. You see, I almost didn't actually check the values I'm entering. I'm checking only the flow part. So, like I got here, and I assume that after I do something like common, I would end up here. This is what you should test on a higher level. You start by putting extra assertions here in the middle, right? For example, here you could say like, I have this, I entered this address, and right now I expect this one. I expect this one because I entered the billing address, and my checkbox is checked automatically because here I'm clicking it, right? And I expect my shipping address be the same as my billing address, right? So this should not let the test pass. Just hint. Yeah, and the test still passes, right? So this is what you would start doing, and later on, in order to make your test simpler, the higher level test simpler, you should remove these assertions and check that you're actually still testing the lines that correspond to these assertions. So for example, here I have a component that does automatic, that sets billing and shipping address automatically together. So I test it on this component level, so I probably don't need these assertions here. it's okay to have assertions on a high level tests in many times, in many places. Certain people say like you should have one assertion per test. It makes sense only if you are only testing what you're testing at this level. If you are actually using this test to test something in the meantime, something at the lower level, you should be okay with putting many assertions in the test, and that's what you should start from. What else? Like, to mock or not to mock is a big question, right? What's your take on that? Mock, right? When you mock, or like, it almost always depends on what you test, right? So mocking backend services at a high level is very difficult sometimes, right? So, for example, I'm talking to a database and I'm loading a very, very complex page. So I have to create a mock that gives me all the data for this page, and the mock itself is several hundred lines long, and it's very, very big ball of stuff. Usually how it comes up, you start your application, at certain point you'd like log the stuff that the real stuff that it gives you paste it, and you start running with this fixture data. Usually it's a symptom. It's a symptom that you are mocking at a wrong abstraction level. Why is that? Because if your test is big and very complicated, you need a lot of data running it. Probably you will be good with like breaking this test into smaller tests. I'm not. Yay! I'm gonna be louder again. So, but generally, if you need a lot of mocks, a lot of mocking data, it's like I said, it's a symptom that you should break your test up, that you should probably rethink what is possible. But try not to compromise things over making your stuff testable. I've seen people doing different things, like for example, getting your application into test mode when all the validation turns off in order for us to get to different stages of the application easier. So the code to turn on and off the testing mode gets to production, and someone starts abusing that, and people learn about it because first you tell your support that they can do that, and they start telling your customers that they can do that, and at a certain point some customers oh, my application doesn't work, I put it into test mode, I add more data, I like it, and all that. In some cases, I managed to get stuff done by doing similar things, like getting into the DevTools, changing the numbers, turning off client-side validation and getting my ticket for the plane, right? It happens sometimes. So, final words. When you're thinking about tests, you start from the top, but your goal is to get to the bottom as fast as possible. Because at the top, things are hard. Things are difficult, and you spend more time and energy into getting to the bottom. Sometimes it's okay not to test certain lines of code, certain pieces, certain glue, in order to get to the bottom faster. So for example, we started doing validation, and instead of getting validation running inside a component, I said, let's build a service and run it separately. Because after we integrate it into our component, we are pretty sure that validation will work, right? Coverage is not one size fits all. It doesn't matter that you cover 100 lines of code. What matters more is how many times a given line of code gets executed during your tests. If a line gets executed a lot of times, then this part of your code base and your test suite is fragile. And you should rethink your tests in order to not let them running over and over the same line of code. It doesn't make sense to do that over and over again. And writing smaller, simpler tests means your tests are running faster. That means that your turn down and setup takes less time, and you can actually do TDD. You can with acceptance tests over here in Chrome, they take about 150 milliseconds each. That I have only 2 tests, and I'm actually in 300 milliseconds already. I'm using a very, very fast test runner. It's not a bad one. It uses the best code base watcher available today, called Watchman by Facebook. So it's doing. I'm running it on a good hardware with SSD. I'm not doing anything else with my hardware at the moment. I'm not running I'm not videotaping. I'm not screenshotting and all of that. And still, this test takes a lot of time. Your tests will probably could take more time or less time depending on how simple or difficult they are. Most of the time here is spent not in the test themselves, but in setup and tear down logic. So the quicker you get down, the easier for you to run fastest test suite. If you end up in a situation when your test suite takes a lot of time to run, try to instead of running the whole suite, try running certain pieces of a suite. Normally, as I work on a bug on a piece of functionality. What I do is I run only one test. I get it fixed, I turn other tests on, I run with them, see which test got broken, if any. If some of them got, I filter based on them, only for them. So I would fix, I fix one test, I got 3 other tests broken, I narrow focus to these 3, I fix them. After that, almost like 100%, no other tests got broken, so it's all good. It's okay if you never run some tests locally, but run them only on CI. As long as the tests inside, the code inside tests is predictable, it's fine. And one thing about like predictable code and tests, can you see what these tests are lacking? What is not in the tests? And it's something I mentioned yesterday in my talk. There was one slide. There is no if statements. There is no for statements. There is a big incentive to, like, as you start writing these repetitive tests, to instead write something that would generate test cases for you. It's a wrong approach. You should almost never do that, because once you start introducing logic into tests, you are introducing logic that is never tested. It might seem similar, like a single for each, a single for loop, and all that, but it adds up. It adds up very quickly. It's unbelievable. I had a test suite with 3, 4 statements, and the test suite was unmanageable completely. They tried to be clever. Don't be clever here. It doesn't matter. One thing that I always like try to see, if I break something, one line of code, and my test broken, if I go into if a new person in your team goes into test and sees the code of the test, can he or she describe you what the test is doing? Like how each piece is working inside this test. Because normally, as you work with your test suite, you are not working with the whole test suite. You are working with only one test case at a time. This is your modus operandi. From line 38 to line 39, this is what you care about. This is a code you would look into, and after that, and like 90% of the time, you would not change it. You would look into it and go check what code is actually being called here, right? So you would see like, hey, I'm going there, I'm doing this. I probably need to check something regarding the billing address. Let's get into the question. Давай. Не, говно цикла. Это математический случай. Я понимаю, что это возможно. Да. Вот. Гусь печаль, да. То есть у меня было, что от этого было только хуже. А ты можешь написать генератор этих тестов? Окей. Хорошо. Смотри. Вот, допустим, я поменял вот этот name, да, здесь, или я поменял вот эту штуку, или я поменял еще что-то, да. Вот здесь можно писать regexp. И вот здесь можно писать regex с заменой. Смотри. Например, я хочу вставить... Тихо. Да, и хороший commit message из серии. Чуваки, мы поменяли это на это. Окей, все. То есть ты же не смотришь на коммит. Ты когда-нибудь смотришь на коммит? Ты смотришь на bisect, где сломалось. Ты находишь, где сломалось, после этого ты смотришь, что за коммит был. Вот когда ты смотришь, что за коммит был, ты смотришь из серии, сломалось вот на этой строчке, когда эту строчку закоммитили в этом коммите. Вот тогда ты пошел в коммит и посмотрел, что там поменялось. Большую часть времени, если ты смотришь на коммит, то альтернатива, ты смотришь на коммит джуниора и просто делаешь ему код-ревью, правильно? Ну такое. Okay, so here's what you do, right? You tell that you are looking for something in the lines, right? And it should be hook input, and between the lines you have anything many times with this. It says no results because I haven't put the invalid regular expression. Man, what's up? It's very small, so yeah. So I found and I want to replace it with who input open brace these ones and $1 because I have a group here. So and instead of $1 I want to put pound there, right? So replace all. Hop, magic. Do that more often. In Vim, you can do it in like one line in a command, right? In these editors, you have to like go somewhere, find like something and all that. It's almost always very easy to do something like this. Like you need to change it in 93 places and not change it in 4 places. You do automatic replace in 93 places, check those 4, change back if you need to, and that's it, right? On Sublime text, instead of $, you need to say /1, /2, /3. In some others, you need percentages, but yeah. Right. So, like, adding more lines of code is okay. No, doing code duplications in tests is okay, because what you end up having is just tests that have only one flow, and that's it. So if you have many tests that do almost the same thing, you are good to go. Like, however, if you start extracting bits and pieces and extracting them in a way that is not obvious, right? So like 2 lines of code get repeated all over the place, but how would you call it there? Like enter, like fill in billing address and name, right? And here you are like, or maybe fill in delivery form, and here you are filling in delivery form, but then you continue filling in delivery form. Sometimes it's very difficult to get to the point when you have meaningful names of these duplicated code passes. So if your name is not expressive enough, and you should ask different people, like, and if the reaction from their side is it's okay, then you know that you are wrong, because there was this in the middle, right? So if it's obvious and they're like, yeah, do that, then it's okay. If it's not obvious, don't do that. Resist the temptation of introducing extra logic in your tests, because it's a path to the dark side when your tests become so complex that you are better off with writing tests for your tests, right? And it's something that is a bit like counterintuitive, because you think like less duplication means less lines of code. Less lines of code means less bugs. Remember that like bugs by line of code are introduced in a code that is like difficult with ifs and fors and all that. No one actually did a study on like number of bugs based on, say, indentation, or like how deep your code goes, or how big cyclomatic complexity is doing. People tried to do it, but they used very small like sample for all of people of code that was available to them. So it's very difficult. There are tools that can show you like, hey, you are changing this line very often, so this line is probably buggy, right? There is a good study that as you do copy pasting, right? The most obvious place when your bugs are getting introduced is the last case. So if I took this test, right, I created several more, right, and changed something in each of them, most likely I made a mistake in the last test. Just recheck the last place you pasted something, the last only. You will save tons of time here. It's a known thing. I think we should like switch to questions, because at this point it was a bit informal, so, and maybe a bit boring. When I speak English, I'm a lot more boring than I speak Russian. I'm sorry about that. And also when it's the second day, I'm more boring than during the first day. Questions? Yay! Давай. Should I translate his questions? It's all good. You got bored, I know. That guy got bored on the back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Да, это будет про то, что... Окей, у тебя упал тест. Откуда ты знаешь, на какой итерации он упал? Мне скажут, что accepted это, а на самом деле получил это, и я в своем массиве вижу, что... Yes, I forgot to mention, good error messages. If you assert something without like putting a good message here, then you are doing yourself a bad favor. Sorry? Ты себе? Yeah? So a lot of people are lazy. They will just like assert X equals Y, and that's it. If you put extra messages with extra logging, then you're probably good. If you're not, then you're probably in a tight spot. But if you do that and you're like very cautious, then I'm fine. Basically, I'm fine with you writing your tests no matter what way you do. I just like telling you what I found out with like using tests a lot more than I used to like 10 years ago. So it might make sense, but in this particular case, I'm feeling the form different ways, right? I'm feeling billing part, but not the shipping part, and I'm feeling billing and shipping part. So I would have two methods in my page object. One would be called filling checkout form with billing address only, and filling checkout form with distinct billing and shipping addresses, something like that. So my names of these methods would be very, very long, because in the stack trace I would see these long names, right, later on. Any more questions? Yay! Yeah, given then this one. Yeah, it's very good. So here I haven't done it, but like basic idea is that reducing your test to assertions only, and like moving the logic of the test into the before side. So you would have a setup somewhere on the top then you would have a small bits of logic, and then you would have assertions. It's good for writing tests when people in your team get used to it as well. So if a person sees this for the first time, then given when then looks a bit different from what we used to in tests. But it's as long as your team is fine with that, it's okay. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter much. You do not write your tests. You doesn't get smaller or larger. Your logic might get a little bit off. Here you can see I have everything in one bit of code. Yeah. Sorry? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does it really matter? In the sense that over here I have some value and I change it here instead of changing it in some variable? I can use it here as well. I mean, it's like these discussions, they're mostly about the style your tests are written, right? For example, people claim that it's behavior driven. It's just whatever words I'm using here. Do I say it or do I say test? And over there, or do I say it or do I say then, right? Given when then it goes a bit further than the other two, right? But these two are mainstream today, so the testing and describing, and that's why I'm showing them and not given when then, because I'm talking about how to write, how to maintain tests, not how to write them. But yeah, if you like it, if you're happy with them, it's great. Mm-hmm. For smaller tests. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You see, the biggest, the win of this is that, like I said, you have a continuous story, right? So you start with setup. You have your actions and your assertions in one single block of code. As you in Gherkin, you get the setup, then you have actions, then you have assertions, and action assertion is far away from the setup. If I have, say, 1,000 lines of code in my test file, and I have one setup over on the top, it's a bit difficult to follow, right? So I have to go up and go down, and and when I say 1,000 lines of code, it might be just a couple of dozens lines of code, all right?